Інтро і передам слово ведучому П'ятого каналу і модератору сьогоднішньої дискусії Роману Чайця. Зараз розпочнеться конференція 26 лютого «Крим – це Україна». Цією подією ми розпочнемо місячник тему Криму в Українському кризовому медіа-центрі. Чому саме була обрана ця дата? Тому що у цей день, рівно рік тому, невеликий, насправді, мітинг кримських татар був під Верховною Радою АРК Крим про те, що цей півострів – це територія України. І ця територія, цей народ – це Україна, це українці. Зараз будемо говорити про те, що
will be saying about what happened during the year when the foreign occupants occupied this peninsula, what's happening with the freedom of speech, with persecution of those who think different. Now I would like to give the floor to Roman Chek, and he will introduce our guests and will be moderating the discussion itself. Thank you. Good afternoon. We would like to welcome you at our first international conference, Crimea is Ukraine. We would like it to be the last international conference on such a problem, on such a topic, but the reality looks different. This is our first panel of two, which we will have today. At this panel, we will be talking about occupation of Crimea, lessons from 2014. I would like to introduce the participants of the panel, panelists, my colleague, the analyst at Radio Freedom TV, host at Espresso TV, Vitaly Portnikov. You also represent Crimea. Also the head chairman of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatars, head of the selection committee designed to choose the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, Refat Chubarov. Also, our guest from Moscow, the politician Andrey Piontkovskyi, political scientist, journalist, politician Mustafa Dzhemilev, president's envoy of the Crimean Tatar issues, human rights activist, Soviet political prisoner. And also I would like to welcome the politician, the MP of many convocations, the head of the Batkivshchina party faction in Crimea, Andrey Senchenko. Also, Bishop Borys Gudziak, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church Bishop, St. Vladimir, the Great Diocese for Eastern Rite Ukrainians in France, and also the president of the Ukrainian Catholic University. I would like it to be happening in such a way that you have a discussion between yourselves, and each of you will have 10 minutes. And during this discussion, Mr. Charlie, the deputy head of presidential administration, promised to join us. I would like the leader of Crimean Tatar people, Mustafa Agat, to start. A very simple question to you. We have today so many pieces of evidence that there were many plans of annexation and occupation of Crimea developed in 2000. Why did they start from Crimea? And why was it irreversible? Why was it not possible to stop? And I would like to remind to our friends, maybe they will show the documentary now. Year ago, quite a numerous meeting. There were about 20,000 Crimean Tatars, Russians and Ukrainians, the citizens of Crimean Peninsula, with the state flags of Ukraine, with the flags of Republic of Crimea, practically stopped the attempt to disintegrate the state near the building of the Parliament of Crimea. A year ago, Russian Federation occupied the Crimean Peninsula. The buildings of the Council of Ministers and the Verkhovna Rada of Autonomy were occupied. The military units of Ukraine were blocked. The Ukrainian TV channels were turned off. The Crimean Peninsula was annexed by Russian Federation, but all the days the Crimean citizens were getting to the actions of protest under Ukrainian flags because Crimea is Ukraine. Mustafa, there were plans, Kharkiv, Donbass, but they started from Crimea. Was it possible to avoid that? Why did they start from Crimea? Yeah, you can talk. Crimea was in Ukraine one of weak links, and Crimean Peninsula is different from other regions of Ukraine because there was the biggest concentration of pro-Russian forces there. First of all, that was explained by the fact, by the ethnic composition. In 1954, it was joined to Ukraine, and there were massive movement of Russian population from inside Russia to Crimea. Russia has never refused from its attempts to expand, even during the so-called democratic years. I remember in 1991, after the session of Kurultai, there was the Supreme Council of Russian Federation, and people came from there, and they were saying that they support Kurultai. They are preparing the documents on recognizing the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, and myself and Chubarov were invited to visit Moscow. We came to the Supreme Council, and the chairman of the Supreme Council was Refat Chubarov. We're waiting for the reception, and the person comes out and says, you know, we're now a Supreme Council. We will be recognizing the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people. We have the whole program of assistance, of returning Crimean Tatar people, and we are also preparing the document on denunciation, the resolution of 1954 about the legal joining Crimea to Russia. You agree that that was illegal because Khrushchev, being drunk, just gave it as a gift. But I said, well, you know, people in Crimea were never asked about anything. There were no referendum there. But why you start from 1954? Let's start from 1780s, when the Crimea was illegally joined to Russia, and then we'll get to 1954, and then they immediately did not even receive us. They did not even mention the recognition of Mejlis, and that's when, and we left with that. So even back in those days, there was this trend in Russia, and all these years, the active Russian propaganda was working on the idea that Crimea is Russian territory, and they knew that the most organized force that could resist that was Mejlis, the Crimean Tatar people, and they were attacking mostly the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people. But Ukraine wasn't making any attempt, wasn't doing anything, wasn't trying to oppose these trends that were financed and supported by Russian Federation on the territory of Crimea. They were doing nothing even to strengthen the pro-Ukrainian forces on the territory of Crimea. Obviously, they were just sure. There were statements made by Putin that there are no territorial claims, that all these statements of different political activists is their point of view. And then there's a big agreement of 1978 about friendship and partnership, which says that the parties will respect the territorial integrity and existing borders. Before that, in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum was signed, where Russia is one of the guarantors of the security and territorial integrity, and nothing serious was done talking about neutralizing the activists, separatists, not about strengthening the defense capacity there. In the years of rule of Yanukovych, I believe that was done on purpose to strengthen the separatist forces were getting stronger, and basically in political Bomon of Ukraine, the attitude to Crimea was of a consumption. They were looking at who will vote for who, because Crimean Tatars have always traditionally been supporting only national democratic forces, and other forces were coming to power. They were either looking at us as at enemies or neutrally, but under Yanukovych there was an open hostile attitude to Crimean Tatars, and they were at the presidential elections. Yanukovych was supported by pro-Russian forces. Our request to legalize, to introduce, to make Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, to make it legal, and only in 1995 the order was passed during Kuchma about the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people. Can we understand this phenomenon? On the 26th of February, many countries were watching online, on air, the events in Simferopol, and then Crimean Tatar activists managed to stop this session, and that's when all these documents were being prepared for this session, how to implement Russian scenario. Within one day, you managed to stop it on the 26th, but at night, then the Russian military, without insignia, are there, and everything changes overnight. You managed to stop it, but why didn't it work finally? The annexation started on the 23rd. On the 23rd, for the first time, these green men were seen in Sevastopol, these special troops of Russian special forces without insignia, and they started occupying public administration offices. On the 26th of February, they were planning to have the meeting of the Parliament of Crimea and to pass the address to Putin. And they brought, I believe, 3,000 people from Sevastopol, some Cossacks, Crimean Tatars, just spontaneously. We were gathering there because of different cases. There was an anniversary of one of the outstanding figures of Crimean Tatar people, and the Crimean Tatars who started coming from all over the Crimea, and there were the majority of us, about 12,000 of us, and then we managed to prevent passing of that. There was a clash between chauvinists and separatists and the Crimean Tatars, but next day, early in the morning, the parliament and the council of ministers were occupied by these green men. There were 90 of them, 110 of them, 70 occupied the parliament and 40 the Council of Ministers, but there was the request from Kiev not to go there to stop the bloodshed, but on the other hand, Kiev was doing nothing to neutralize the terrorists. About 20 kilometers away from Simferopol, Alpha was not doing anything. They could come and neutralize 110 persons.
Alpha in Simferopol, how many were there? They say, some say 1,500, some say 2,000. So there was a possibility to act. And you say there was a request from Kiev to abstain. Who requested this? Maybe Refat will tell us more, because it was he who was in contact with those people. I will talk briefly just to remember what was happening a year ago. On the 23rd of February, Mejlis held a massive rally on the central square. This was Sunday, and we have announced this rally on the 28th of January because this was the anniversary of the first Mufti of Crimea, head of Kurultai. We are talking about the 23rd of February to 1918. We mark this tragic date every year. And at that night, together with Mufti of Crimea, several well-known representatives of Russian military and Russian intellectuals were killed. On the 23rd of February, at this rally, we adopted a resolution which said that there won't be monopoly of any political force in Crimea, any ethnic group, that we all, Tatars, Russians, Ukrainians, will rule Crimea. But we say that there is a threat to Crimea. This is the Crimean Supreme Council, and we asked the Ukrainian parliament to dissolve the Crimean parliament immediately. On the 25th, we get to know that they are trying to assemble extraordinary session and adopt a resolution in favor of Russia. On the 25th, I spent my whole day in the office of Konstantinov in the Supreme Council of Crimea, and I see for the first time Konstantinov so afraid, so internally scared. He is a businessman, he is a sort of a man engaged in chicanery, and he always finds a compromise when there's a threat. But this time, when I see that we tell him we won't allow you to hold a session, he says the session will happen. More than that, they show us draft documents that as if tell us that they are seeking the way to remain within the Ukrainian state. There's not a word about Russia. I see that our talks are unsuccessful, and we convene Mejlis, and we do announce the rally on the 26th of February. I meet heads of police and security service, because we get to know that the so-called Russian Unity Party of Sergei Aksyonov announces a rally on the same time. And we talk that so that to avoid some clashes, and it happened so that Crimean Tatars came en masse, and not only Crimean Tatars, but also Ukrainians and quite a lot of Russians. There were people of different ethnic origins, adherents of the unity of Ukraine. By 3 p.m. the session has to start, and we worked on the evening of the 25th with all the Crimean councillors, so that they do not attend the session, because there is a threat that they will be involved in anti-statehood activity. And I and Mr. Andrey Senchenko, when Konstantinov came at 3 p.m. to open the session, we saw that there are only 49 councillors, and we made Konstantinov to stop the session because they lacked the quorum. More than that, we talked to the councillors, and we thought that a lot of them understood what we were talking about, because many of them thought that they should look for an understanding with Kyiv, but many of them were afraid of what was happening in Kyiv, as they were afraid of the victory of the democratic forces in Ukraine. On the 26th, we went away because we were convinced that we saved Crimea, that we rescued Ukraine, but even on the day when this massive rally happened, there were some events that we saw, but I could not even think how it would happen. We saw some unfamiliar people in the office of Mr. Konstantinov, who displayed military bearing, and when this rally was happening, the head of the Crimean security service called me and said that there are two men with submachine guns from Sevastopol, and they have the task to open fire. And I asked whom they will be firing at, because there were both adherents and opponents of Ukraine there, and he said no difference. They just want to provoke a clash and bloodshed in order to launch additional forces. Praise God, what they planned did not happen, or as some analysts said, this did not happen, but the next morning at 4:40 a.m. I got a phone call which woke me. This was again the head of the security service in Crimea, and said that a number of people heavily armed entered the Crimean parliament, and that they have huge bags, and this is a specific kind of weapons to kill people en masse. I asked, why do you call me? You have your own duty. You have to perform it. You know, we don't know what they want to do, he said, but we think that they can fire at people if they assemble. And he said, find your own way out of the situation. So, because I had access to some opportunities provided by mass media, I aired a brief announcement saying that the situation is such and such, and that we wait for the reaction of state bodies and special forces. And I ask people to go on guard, but not to approach those premises. This was my appeal. But at 8 a.m., when I asked our guys to see what is going on around Simferopol, from the settlement of Gvardeyska, where there is one of the bases of Black Sea Navy, and there's a military airfield, 6 APCs went to the outskirts of Simferopol. I sent people to ask them who are those people, and they said that they are just returning to Sevastopol from the airfield, but they got broke, so they are waiting for the repair brigade. And at that moment I understood that the situation was changing rapidly in another direction. Can you be more precise about, you were in contact with Kiev. At that time there was Maidan still in Kiev, and this was several days after Yanukovych fled to Russia. Whom did you talk in Kiev, and who had the authority to tell you something? I don't remember that I talked to someone directly. I was just consulting some MPs, Mustafa Dzhemilev and Mr. Kunitsyn, and we were talking about how can we engage those officials who could command the military, because everyone was waiting to see how the units of the Ukrainian armed forces would behave, and this was for us very important. But if we talk about the request not to provoke, to display patience, that we were promised that they will find a way out, You know, this was in 1 or 2 days after. And this was not just from the Ukrainian politicians, but also from many ambassadors and representatives of international bodies. And now I'd like to answer the question whether it was possible not to allow this to happen. I don't know today. I don't know a definite answer. I know the point of view of those who were acting president, for instance, Mr. Turchinov. I know the point of view of other leaders. And if we simplify it, then it is like this. If we were put in armed resistance, then the Russian troops were waiting for this, and they would have interfered in Ukraine and went into Ukraine somewhere in the east. I am not a military person, but I think there was a brief span of time where we had to resort to resolute action. It was the entire day on the 27th and half of the day on the 28th, probably, until there was a full-scale intervention from Russia into Crimea. But this is just a hypothesis. I know for sure that they were waiting, they were expecting that we will try to seize the Supreme Council of Crimea on the 26th. And some people say that if we seized the Supreme Council on the 26th and remained there, we wouldn't have provided an opportunity for the direct aggression or the intervention of Russian troops. I know that they were calculating for this option, and they actually planned that Crimean Tatars and other adherents of Ukraine's integrity, why there were those two people with submachine guns, that they were expecting our action, and they would say that there was a direct threat to Russians, and they would resort to direct action too. Mr. Senchenko, a classical stereotype that Crimea was ceded. We've been hearing this for an entire year. But was there really an opportunity to stop the scenario by force? I'd like to continue Refat's deliberation about the scenario of provoking Crimean Tatars who were at the rally to seize the buildings of the Supreme Council and the Council of Ministers. I do think that there was such a scenario, and they would unwind the spiral of interethnic conflict that would allow them to solve at once two tasks: to occupy Crimea and to unwind the repressions against Crimean Tatars. You know, if we talk about the history of the issue, those plans were always there. We remember the so-called President Meshkov, but Russia did not want to introduce military component. Political technologists and the Federal Security Service were engaged, but Yeltsin was toying with the idea that Ukraine would be an eternal satellite, no European integration, no NATO, and he was sort of treating Ukraine with a degree of mercy. But the roots are, of course, in much earlier times, because for 2 decades the Ukrainian authority was not interested in Crimea. They were interested only in acquiring some property at the seacoast. And there was a local Crimean elite who were ready to serve them. Then the so-called Donetsk Kiev-Donetsk occupation of the Crimea, and the local elite served them. But we don't know how much of a real pro-Russian sentiment was there. Let's remember parliamentary elections of 2012 in Crimea and Sevastopol. Russian unity, which before the elections was consolidating the shreds of pro-Russian organizations, in Sevastopol they got less than Svoboda party in Sevastopol, something like 1.2, 1.3%, and up to 1.5% in the rest of Crimea. But of course, we should understand that around 20% of people in Crimea, the elderly people and military pensioners, are making a high proportion there, and they are not linked to Crimea by anything. They have just demobbed from, let's say, northern Russian fleet, and they were going around between the Party of Regions, communists or pro-Russian separatists. But do you remember several years ago when we were analyzing the possibility and probability of explosive situation in the Crimean Peninsula, there was a stereotype that the number of owners of property on the sea coast and the Russian business and Russian politicians and Ukrainian politicians were the guarantee against the explosion of military scenario. But this wouldn't have happened without Russian bayonets. I can tell you the 28th of February, in the morning we were in Simferopol, and I was flying away from Simferopol at 11 p.m. And there was a lot of Crimean councillors, deputies, who all told me that they had 76 voices in order to replace Mohylev and Konstantinov. And their only request was not to get another prime minister from Kiev. But then the Russian bayonets came, and they were all subject to Konstantinov and Mohylev. And I think that we should have used those votes and change the leadership of the parliament and the cabinet of ministers in Crimea. Of course, this would not make the situation simple, would not have made it simple, but it wouldn't have been so easy for Russia. On the 26th, I spoke for 2 hours with the Berkut Special Force in Simferopol. They were barricaded, they were scared, and they were sandbags and machine guns. After 2 hours of talks with them, I managed to calm them down. But of course, you couldn't even think that they would have protected the Ukrainian statehood in Crimea. I also talked to the internal troops in Crimea, and they were just not able to perform an elementary order to protect public order in the street because they were not back to their senses after they were exploited here on Maidan. But what if there were a command from the authority? Were there any units in Crimea to perform the order from Kiev?
It's difficult for me to tell about military units, but militia or interior troops, no. And the events were taking place on the 26th. These green men occupied the building on the 27th, and Ukrainian government was formed on the 27th in the second half of the day, and there was a vacuum of authorities. I would like to maybe make such a bridge and say, well, but what to do tomorrow? I disagree with someone who says we will first create a wonderful future in Ukraine, get integrated to Crimea, and then we will get Crimea back. And I also disagree with those who are doing nothing to return Crimea, and they hope that Crimean Tatars will pave the road back for Crimea, the road back to Ukraine. I believe that the authorities today have plenty of instruments, but the main fight is you have to counteract the aggression in Crimea. But actually we are counteracting to our citizens. We do not allow them to continue their relations and communication with continental part of Ukraine when we just stop railway transportation. But there should be the fight, which will be not only at the level of propaganda. We need to develop the tomorrow's model of the structure of Crimea, which would provide answers to the most important questions, which would be acceptable by Crimean people and which would be the guarantee of sustainable entry of Crimea into Ukraine. Yes, but is it possible to fight for the minds of population in Crimea if you gave this example of 1991? For myself, here I would like to say, just like Andrey, so that from reminiscences, from memories, we come to what needs to be done. I would like to say one more thing. Were it possible and what were to be done. It happened so that for several weeks I met with different generals of the army who would come to Mejlis, because they, as many others, did not know how to behave, because they wouldn't receive any command, any order. There were no clear orders from Kiev. On the 27th of February, when there were these so-called green men in the building of the parliament, Girkin, I think, was there. Girkin is on the photographs following Aksionov. Was together with the then Prime Minister Mogilov at one of the offices. Mogilov was a person who was destroying, ruining Mejlis. He was doing everything to kill the Crimean Tatar national movement. And on the 27th, we together were looking for the ways how to stop this movement into the precipice. We were trying to do that, but what happened after? When they finally, because there was no quorum, but on the 27th after afternoon, they had this session. They appointed Aksionov, Mr. Mogilov, and his high civil official. We shouldn't be talking just about military. He just gave the interview. He said, we worked hard. Now let another government work. And if we want not to have repetitions of such tragedies in the future without any hysteria, we need to understand what was the role of every government official in Crimea at that time. The militia heads and also the Prime Minister. Also, what needs to be done? There should be approved strategy for the development of Crimea. There are different approaches. There are different forces, public sector, scientific, who have developed the approaches, but there's not one integral program. And the program should include all the factors, the behavior of people who live on the occupied Crimea, international factor, internal factor. Unfortunately, we still don't have such a strategy, and now we cannot talk about such attack in this direction. And one more thing, I absolutely agree with what Andrey was saying. Everyone who thinks that return of Crimea is the second or third, our secondary task, for example, that we will now strengthen the Crimea, is a mistake, a huge mistake. For Ukraine, it's very threatening because today we know that without resolving the problem of Crimea, without return of Crimea, without leaving these territories by aggressor, Ukraine will have no future. I believe everyone knows that. Mr. Piontkovskyi, well, can you start from a hashtag Crimea is our, and the discussion which is going on in Ukraine, is that Ukraine that surrendered Crimea to Russia, or Russia took Crimea from Ukraine?
Well, I would not like to interfere into the internal political discussion in Ukraine, because here you don't like when Muscovites come and begin to issue advice. I would rather talk about the reaction of the world community on to what has happened in Crimea and what is happening in Ukraine, because this is not a Russian-Ukrainian crisis, this is becoming a world crisis. We have the title here, Lessons of 2014. I'll try to talk on the lessons that the world community is getting from the events of 2014. I think that in future history textbooks, the 18th of March of 2014 will be a very important date, because this is not just the legal strengthening of the annexation of legal confirmation of the annexation of Crimea, but this is the speech of Mr. Putin, where he actually declared that it is his right to protect not even the citizens of Russia, but ethnic Russians or Russian-speaking, or even heirs of those who lived in the Soviet Union or in Russian Empire. Many people have said that the speech of Mr. Putin is a repeat, in fact, of Hitler's Sudeten speech, like a collection of the divided nation, the concept of Russian world, which is the analog to German Reich. All the concepts of Russian foreign policy are similar to German foreign policy of 1930s. This was so evident that one of the propagandists of Kremlin, Mr. Migranyan, said that yes, of course, Putin is talking and acting like Hitler, but like a good Hitler, because there were two different Hitlers. Like Hitler in 1930s was a good guy who was responding to aspirations of Crimean, of German people, but then he became bad. Okay, let's talk about the civilized world or collective West or world community. They understood that they are being challenged, and the hybrid war about which Russian propaganda likes to talk was launched because the minimum realization of the concept of Russian world includes the change of at least two NATO member countries like Estonia and Latvia, where they have a sizable Russian minority. So what was the first reaction? Probably, and the first reaction was maybe we will agree to the annexation of Crimea and Mr. Putin will get calmed down. And if you remember the Geneva Protocol in April, they did not even mention the word Crimea, and there was an idea on the conferences of Russian and American experts, like at the Isle next to Helsinki. Okay, annexation of Crimea, but the major thing is that Vova should not go further. But he was on the peak of euphoria, and he designated a very concrete aim, New Russia, and he also started a hybrid war against Baltic states. Then they had another question in the West. Okay, the guy declares his hybrid war against the West, which on every level does is more powerful on every level in resources. Russia is a backward country that depends on the West technologically. NATO and the US are ahead militarily, and he said that, and he replied that he will win at using the nuclear blackmail. The colleagues told us about Crimea, and there was such a situation there where he was raising the stakes all the time. Like, you will put up the resistance in Crimea, I will launch a mass intervention over the border. If my green men come to Baltics and you'll try to throw them out, I will launch a nuclear war and you will be scared. This is a very serious threat. And Europe was paralyzed by it. And this last visit of Merkel to Moscow, unexpected, 3 months after Brisbane, she was talking very strictly to Putin, but then she went to meet him. This is a result of direct blackmail. She went there a day after the future Minister of Defense said in the American Congress that he will sell arms to Ukraine, and she remembers very well that if that Moscow said that it will use new tactical nuclear weapons in Europe if U.S. sells arms to Ukraine, and the challenge was thrown to Americans as the only comparable nuclear country. And the U.S. said that they will protect Baltics. This is not just the declaration, and there are 100 or 200 American soldiers in Latvia and Estonia. Of course, this is a symbolic number, but they are, let's say, hostages of death. It means that if green men appear in Latvia or Estonia, this means that Russia is automatically involved in the war with the US. And this is the thing that Putin tried to avoid with his blackmail. Does it relate to Ukraine? Yes, of course. Americans could not but demonstrate that they would protect Baltics. Otherwise, this would have meant the end of NATO, the end of West as a subject of international affairs, and the end of the USA as the world power. But of course, they do not want to follow the scenario of nuclear war. Where's the Crimea here? That's why they want Putin to suffer a defeat in Ukraine. Because if he wins in Ukraine and his aim is to destroy Ukrainian state, as was rightly said by Mr. Kuchma today, that after Minsk II, Putin issued an ultimatum to Ukraine, and this ultimatum is clear from his interview to Solovyov, and his aim is the destruction of Ukraine, and the US should not allow this, not just because they love Ukraine, but because they should be concerned about their own safety and security, because the victory of Putin in Ukraine would mean the next step in the Baltics and the necessity to face him in a nuclear conflict. That's why the Americans will sell weapons to Ukraine. They are close to this. They won't go to war in Ukraine. No one will go to war in Ukraine. And the very first statement of Obama and Rasmussen was that Ukraine is not a NATO member and they won't participate. But now they have, in hindsight, understood how important the significance of Ukraine and Baltics is. But there are strict economic sanctions and a political and psychological pressure which responds to the spirit of hybrid war. The financial intelligence in the U.S. know very well the assets of Russian leadership, and they can arrest and freeze them everywhere. So the issue of getting Crimea back to Ukraine is the issue of the result of this global hybrid war. I do agree with the message of the Russian Federation saying that they do not wage war against Ukraine. It is just the war of the Russian world with Anglo-Saxon world on the territory of Ukraine. Yes, this is the war of the Putin's Russian world against Western civilization, and the future of Western civilization, Ukraine and Crimea, depends on this. How do I see the defeat of Putin? It is so evident for the Russian elite is the flop, the failure of his Ukrainian adventurous engagement, that the stealing KGB mafia that rules Russia now will see it necessary to remove Putin from power, thus eliminating the negative after effects of his foreign policy. And if the West wins, then the return of Crimea will become a matter of procedure. But if he wins, he will own not only Ukraine, but Europe as a whole.
We mentioned another part of hybrid war that is fighting for brains, and from the 1st of March, FSB promises to decide on what to do with the Crimean mosques, with the Ukrainian churches. They will get rid of them, I believe. So I believe that reaction was so fast that on the 15th of March, the Greek Catholic priest, Priest Mykola, was arrested and beaten up. And without mentioning all the details in the result, all 5 Greek Catholic priests had to leave the Crimea and take out their children, their families. Some of them came back, but the style of work with the Greek Catholic Church was set. Similar things were happening with Kiev Patriarchy. Even Jewish communities were scared to say nothing about Crimean Tatars. What is the situation today? In Crimea, in the beginning of 2014, there were 2,803 religious communities. 2/3 were registered, 1,409. About 700 were acting without registration. I mean that within 25 years, the number grew up from 47 communities to 2,083 communities. According to Russian legislation of 1994, which was amended in 14, the communities which have no registration cannot act. And all these communities were without registration. And the time frame for re-registration was set up till 31st of December. Then it was prolonged till the 1st of March. In a few days, this time frame expires, and all the communities which are not registered in accordance with the legislation have no right for activity. Now, out of these, the Russian Federation officials in Crimea and Crimean officials, they recognize that the process of registration is very slow. Only 9 communities are registered, 73 are in the process from the point of view of the authorities. Other communities are refused in taking in documents. They give them back the documents without any written explanation or written evidence that some copy of documents were submitted. There is a bureaucratic work going on to make these communities paralyzed. And there are many believers, Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics of Kiev Patriarchy, leave. And now there is quite questionable, and it's under the threat, the existence of many religious communities in Crimea. They are in minority, but each civilization is assessed according to how they treat their minorities. Do you see any way for dialogue for brains? Mass media cut off. This transportation and other types of siege of the peninsula. The dialogue of Ukrainian authorities, it's difficult to imagine how it could take place with the population. The only source could be religious communities, at least once a week. But now, if they get rid of them and they continue repressions against the Crimean Tatar people, then how can the dialogue with the future Crimea take place? I believe that people who know Crimea, who live in Crimea, can tell more. And the leaders of Crimean Tatars can tell us this is very complicated work, because we know that we need to counteract and we need to do what wasn't done in the past. The work of these small communities, Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics, Kiev Patriarchy, will not be satisfactory to get this flow of propaganda back, to repel this flow of propaganda. Vitaly, maybe someone else would say, but Vitaly, do you believe that it is possible to return Crimea back? As Mr. Piontkovskyi said, after Putin, this may happen, but is there any way to get Crimean brains back to Ukraine? I don't think this is our priority task today, because we saw the situation when the population of one of the regions of our country, in the result of some constitutional procedures, in the result of some legal referendum, in the situation when there was a competition of political positions and views, decided to get separated from another part of the country, at least like it was in Catalonia or in Scotland. So to fight for brains for people who are under occupation is possible only after the occupational troops are withdrawn, are taken out, and after the beginning of the realistic process of integration of the Republic of Crimea into constitutional environment of Ukraine. And only after that we can talk about how to return the brains. And after the judicial processes of those who were citizens of Crimea and who were representatives of Russian Federation who were helping in annexation will be held. And also it is obvious that we will not be able to change the situation in Crimea if we do not understand all the mistakes of Ukrainian state in the period of 1991 and 2014. And the main mistake was that Kiev itself, most of the population of Ukraine did not want to recognize what is Crimea and what is Crimean autonomy. Crimean autonomy appeared on the political map of Ukraine as a scheme in relations between Kiev and Simferopol clans, but not like the reflection of the autonomy that existed in Soviet times, and that was the reflection of the statehoodness that existed on the territory of the present Crimea, the statehoodness of Crimean Khanship, of Crimean Tatars. Even Bolsheviks, after the disintegration of Russian Empire, had to recognize these realities, and independent Ukraine did not recognize them. We have never had even small attempt to understand that the constitutional system of Crimea's autonomy could be different from the system of any other subjects of Ukraine, only in the situation when the Crimean autonomy is the autonomy which is national ethnical, but the autonomy of no one against anyone, because the national composition of the population of Crimea was just exactly like the national ethnic composition of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. And if Crimea can be autonomy, why Donbass cannot be autonomy? That is what they are talking about from Moscow. Putin, Surkov, those who are dismantling our own statehoodness. And if Crimean Tatar people are the people that are making the state of Crimea, if we recognize the fact of occupation of Crimean Khanship by the troops of Catherine the Great, like Ukraine was occupied by Moscow Tsars, then by Moscow Bolsheviks, who were destroying the statehoodness of Ukrainian National People's Republic, and so if we recognize all these occupational acts, then Ukrainian people and Crimean Tatar people on the territory of two statehoodness that existed here as the great Principality Lithuanian, Rich Pospolita, Crimean Khanship, are building the statehoodness which are fixed on statehood identity of these two nations. Just like we all politically are Ukrainians, the citizens of Crimea had to be and should become identically Crimeans. People who will be studying Crimean Tatar language at school, irrespective of their origin, not Ukrainian, but Crimean Tatar, which had to become the second language for Crimea for everyone, who would be learning the history of Crimea and know exactly that Sevastopol is not the city of Russian glory, but the place of Crimean Tatar genocide. If the citizens of Crimea understand where they are, then we wouldn't have this problem with Crimean autonomy, but that wasn't happening, and it is to be happening now. What is the fighting for brains, creating the parliament of Crimean exile, which should be recognized by the international community as the only representative of the will of Crimea, creating the government of Crimea in exile, like Georgians are doing, others whose territories are occupied by aggressor. Recognition of the status of Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people as the only expression of not just the interests of a certain ethnic group in Crimea, but as the representative of the statehoodness which can exist only if its functions are recognized. The assistance to develop the Crimean Tatar culture, language on the territory of Ukraine, because the occupant will not be doing it, it will be doing everything possible to continue what Catherine the Great started, who were just those who were raping the civilization. And if we stop playing with the chauvinists who live in Crimea, if we do not, if we say clearly all these things to them, then after Russian statehoodness is reformatted, after it becomes democratic, stops existing, then we'll be able to talk to the population of Crimea on very simple legal grounds. We have to recognize the choice of everyone. Russia provided their citizenship to most citizens of Crimea. That's normal situation and conditions of occupation. We believe all these people are our own citizens, and that's also something regular when aggression is taking place. But these people are not guilty in living with dual citizenship. We need, after the aggression is stopped, to give the people this opportunity to decide on their citizenship, like when I was the resident in Moscow in 1991, I just gave my passport back to Russian consul, and I became the citizen of Ukraine. Those who do not want to give away their Russian passport away, they can live in Crimea, but as the citizens of a foreign state, they will not participate in that territory, but will not be able to decide on its destiny. We can even allow them to participate in regional elections, but they cannot be elected or elect to the Crimean parliament. And those who do not want to be Russian citizens that live on the territory of Crimea, we help them go to their real motherland. This motherland came to them on tanks, and on tanks they can go back to their motherland. That's very simple. A very interesting thing. I would like